So welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Shirley Graham and I'm the Director of the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs here at the Elliott School of International Affairs. I am absolutely thrilled to have you all join us here this evening. This is, as you know, the concluding event of an all-day launch of the new DC Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security. And it has been quite a day. We're not going to have the time to recap all that has happened throughout the day, but I think this conversation we're going to have this evening will give you a good flavor and overview of some of the research and policy issues that we are focusing on as a student group. Now, we have here with us this evening Ambassador Melanne Verveer of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security and Dr. Chantal de Jonge Oudraat of Women in International Security. We're absolutely delighted to have you both join us. Thank you so much. And we will be engaging both in conversation throughout this evening. So this evening's event, just to remind you, there isn't going to be an opportunity for Q&A, but we will have recordings of this event, the workshops, the 4 parallel workshops we had over the lunch break, and also our event this morning. They are going to be circulated widely. They're going to be made available online. So you can, if you weren't able to participate earlier, you'll be able to see all of those. And of course, if you attended one of our workshops earlier, you'll have missed out on the other 3. And no doubt you'll be interested to find out what the discussions were like in those. So just as a very brief recap, we had opening remarks this morning by Kathleen Keenest of the U.S. Institute for Peace, and also Sanam Naragi Anderlini of ICANN. We also had the Dean of the Elliott School, Dr. Ayres, join us for those opening remarks. And the focus was very much on women and peace processes and women's overwhelming exclusion from formal peace processes, and looking at different strategies and approaches to ensure their involvement and their inclusion. We also talked about the importance of including gender across all teaching in international affairs and breaking down silos within and between disciplines and having an interdisciplinary approach to teaching gender. Over the workshops in the afternoon, we talked about, we had 16 research and policy experts come and talk to us on 4 different topics. So LGBTQI perspectives and understandings of international security. We also had engaging men and boys in gender equality in foreign policy. We also had a panel on intergenerational gendered trauma. And we also had a panel on, of course, feminist foreign policy. So in those panels, we discussed issues such as the importance of trusting and listening to local communities when it comes to trauma and working with trauma and victims of trauma, and very much listening to what those particular communities wish for and want to help support. We also talked about the importance of co-creating programming and policy in relation to feminist foreign policy and recognizing different understandings of terms such as feminism and gender in different cultural contexts. We also talked about the importance, and we've talked about this a lot, of not conflating women with gender and making sure that we separate out the 2, because otherwise it's exclusionary of LGBTQI populations. We also talked about how when we're engaging men and boys, the importance of ensuring that programming involves women from the community at all levels, but also specifically focused on eroding those discriminatory norms that create barriers for women's inclusion. So we had a lot of really rich and interesting conversations throughout the day. I'm now going to remind you just in terms of the format of today. We're going to begin with a conversation with Ambassador Verveer, and then we are going to move on to a follow-on conversation with Dr. de Jonge Oudraat. And so now I'm going to hand over to my colleagues here today. I'm going to hand over to Nicholas Zorowski. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Dr. Graham. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Zorowski, and I am the president of the DC Student Consortium on Women, Peace, and Security. It is my privilege to introduce Ambassador Melanne Verveer as the first keynote participant of the plenary closing session of the consortium's all-day launch event. In the interest of time, we will not read out the full bios of our final keynote speakers, but we will include them in the chat for everyone's reference. Ambassador Verveer is the executive director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and serves as a special representative on gender issues for the OSCE chairperson in office. Ambassador Verveer previously served as the first U.S. ambassador for global women's issues, a position to which she was nominated by President Obama in 2009. She worked to ensure that women's participation and rights are fully integrated into U.S. foreign policy, and she played a leadership role in the administration's development of the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. During the Clinton administration, she served as assistant to the president and chief of staff to the First Lady. She also led the effort to establish the president's Interagency Council on Women and was instrumental in the adoption of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Ambassador Revere has a BS and MS from Georgetown University and holds several honorary degrees. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Secretary of State's Award for Distinguished Service. I am so thrilled to welcome Ambassador Verveer.
Well, Nick, it's such a pleasure to be here with you and Dr. Graham, and I just want to salute you and all of those who've engaged with you in creating this extraordinary Women, Peace, and Security Consortium with students. I can just tell you that our Georgetown chapter is a group of very dedicated and exciting graduate students, many of them who are enrolled in our certificate program for Women, Peace, and Security. So the combination of being able to do the academic work in a lot of the areas that Dr. Graham read out that have gotten your attention today, and the fact that they can have the activities and the experiences of the consortium is really a win-win. So I just want to thank everybody associated with creating this extraordinarily vibrant opportunity for students.
Of course. Well, we are so grateful for your contributions to the beginning of this organization. So with that being said, I'd like to just kind of get right into it, into this Q&A session. So to begin, I kind of want to look at some major developments in the current administration on the institutionalization of gender. So of course, Ambassador, you're a trailblazer in this field. You were the first US ambassador for global women's issues. And in this role, you traveled to nearly 60 countries to oversee policy that aims to promote the advancement of women. What are your thoughts on the newly formed White House Gender Policy Council in terms of further mainstreaming gender and foreign policy and international security? I'd like to hear your thoughts on the future wins and obstacles that you anticipate for this Gender Policy Council.
Well, thank you, Nick. I think the new Gender Policy Council that was announced yesterday by President Biden with his executive order creating it is really a movement in the right direction. Actually, it is the continuum of an evolutionary process, as I see it. 25 years ago, when the United States was preparing for the 4th UN World Conference on Women, we really set up a structure, then President Clinton did, called the Interagency Council on Women. And that was to ensure that the best ideas that came out of Beijing were actually incorporated into the work of our government. And some of the various earliest developments that took place in the State Department, which might be very interesting to the students, were innovations that were made those years ago. And one of them, for example, in the department that has to do with human rights, labor, and democracy issues, some of these issues that we know are violations of human rights, abuses of women were not even on the agenda, because it wasn't until Beijing that many of them got this whole concept of women's rights issues chiseled into international human rights law. It was a time when, if you were traveling around the world and you asked the desk person at the State Department what was the status of women in a given country, education, economic, etc., they couldn't tell you, because nobody collected that information. The embassies didn't report. So think of that as we think of where we've come today. After the Clinton administration, the Obama administration had its White House Council on Women and Girls, which I think predominantly focused on domestic issues, because at that point, the position that I held was created, and that was the integrative office to take issues like women, peace, and security and integrate them, mainstream them throughout the State Department. So today, coming full circle, as of yesterday's action, you've got this new White House Council that is on this continuum. But think of the Domestic Council, which I think anybody who studies the structure of the White House knows about, the Domestic Policy Council, the Economic Policy Council. Both have been there as long as I can remember, very important entities in that overall operation. And now you've got, on the same level, the Gender Policy Council. And its role is to really take these issues, not just quote unquote women's issues or gender issues, but to look at the landscape of issues, COVID and how we're going to recover, climate and how we're going to deal with it, and to ensure that when policies are being developed, either economic policies, domestic policies, or the National Security Council is that third council, international policies, that there is a gender lens, a gender perspective that is applied to these arenas. Now, that is taking this to a new level, and I think we can all applaud what it represents in terms of the things that we've been very concerned about. And today, of course, we have a great interest in women, peace, and security. And we have a law in the United States, and how that law gets implemented will have a lot to do with both the State Department arm as well as the White House. So with respect to the State Department, we know that the appointees have been made to the White House, and the two co-chairs are excellent in every respect, very experienced. They don't come in as newbies in a way. They are steeped in these issues. And then when the next ambassador is nominated in the Office of Global Women's Issues, her mandate will be to really continue this mainstreaming, which is an imperfect process at this point. Nobody's reached nirvana in doing this exceptionally well. But the mandate of that office is, in a way, to reinforce what's happening in the White House through the National Security Council. And you had Jamila Biggio this morning as one of your speakers. Jamila started in the Global Women's Issues Office, and then spent a good bit of time in the Obama administration on the National Security Council, working many of the same issues, but in a different seat, both of which were incredibly important to the development of policy. So that when the next ambassador comes into the Global Women's Issues position, and that office continues to function and function well in many respects, it is to ensure, this has to be understood, it is to integrate this lens in all of the work of the State Department. So it's in the work of our embassies, in the work of the Economics Bureau, the Conflict and Stability Bureau, all the regional offices that cover the world. Are we doing the best that we can do? Because the whole point of this is really to create more effective outcomes to further U.S. policy. We know that no country can get ahead if it leaves its people behind. And it's critically important, as our national strategy points out and recognizes, that women's rights are advanced and protected and the opportunities are there. Those countries are far more prosperous and peaceful. And when you look at, for example, if I can just mention another aspect, the Women, Peace, and Security Index that we put out at the Georgetown Institute, when it's looking at the well-being of women, as it does through 3 dimensions, inclusion, justice, and security, the countries that are at the bottom on the well-being of women are the countries, guess what? They're mired in conflict, they're unstable, they have all kinds of problems because the condition of women is so important. The condition of women and the condition of nations goes hand in hand, or has been said, the fate of women and the fate of nations goes hand in hand. So this is really important. Now, you asked Nick about obstacles. You can put the perfect structure in place. It can be meaningless if the political will isn't there, if it's not validated from the top, if the next rung up doesn't see why this is important. You really need to have that kind of respect for and commitment to and validation of these issues for them to really succeed. And I'll just say, for example, as Women, Peace, and Security was being implemented in the Department of Defense, for example, if nobody in the Secretary's operation saw its relationship to what was happening in terms of the operational effectiveness of DoD, well, it's not going to get much attention. You're going to have very good people committed to it, laboring in the vineyard, but not a whole lot in terms of the difference it could truly make. So this is a very, very good start. And I think complement to what will happen at state will put these issues and related issues hopefully in a much stronger position in terms of the actions of the U.S. government.
Perfect. That's a fantastic answer, Ambassador Verveer. I was planning to follow up on, can you go on the background, the history of, the Interagency Council on Women into the White House Council on Girls into the current Gender Policy Council. So you read my mind, but I just really echo your idea that the structures are one thing. The structures are the skeleton. The political will is the heart and the blood, and your body can't live if your heart's not pumping. So I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Shirley Graham for our second overall question for you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Ambassador. So really building off of your remarks, Ambassador, in terms of this development with the Gender Policy Council at the White House, and of course also we have the Women, Peace and Security Act. And I just wondered if you could discuss with us perhaps a conflict or a humanitarian context whereby if we had a gender perspective or a gender lens really informing policy, the difference that would make. And then what we need to do in terms of influencing, persuading policymakers to look at these issues very much through a gender lens. I know we have all the building blocks there, as you have set out very, very clearly, but we do have crises where a gender lens is not being applied. So could you perhaps expand on that a little for us? Thank you.
Well, this goes to the heart of the matter. I think this question is so critical because what is a framework worth? What is mainstreaming worth if it doesn't truly happen? And I would say that to this day, the majority of conflicts and humanitarian crises may have some minimal application of a gender lens, but not a real factoring in as decisions are being made country by country, event after event, in a way that creates that kind of more effective solution. You can look at the conflict in Ukraine. It's one that's happening as we're sitting here. Reports keep coming in about, whether or not the attempts at a ceasefire have been broken. The conditions across that dividing line are horrific across the war zone. In essence, there is a peace process. There is something called the Minsk process, but it seems so often removed, as these processes do. Many of them are frozen. They don't seem to change the realities on the ground at all. And in many ways, it's removed to what peace builders are doing, to the work that is going on by people with experience, living in the situations where they're living, with the ability to understand what needs to be done, issues that need to be brought to the table that often never get there. So take a country like Ukraine, which has made incredible progress. They have a national action plan, which they've just renewed after a lot of work. Their action plan was created during the war, and it continues the war. They have a coordinating mechanism in the government, in the deputy prime minister's office, so that it's not one agency on WPS, which is similar to all agencies, but yet somehow overseeing what the others are doing. They've actually centered this in the deputy prime minister's office. So you have differences that they've made in policing, differences that they've made in women's representation and defense. They have truly begun that process. And yet this backdrop of the war, whether it's in terms of some governments that are engaged, not saying, why aren't we doing more? Why aren't we investing more, either through our assistance programs or diplomatic efforts? And why isn't that process hearing more or actually having more women engaged in it? And I think this is what you see. It's not unique to Ukraine, and different ones of these places are either in a little better shape or worse shape. I think currently, in terms of what's happening in Afghanistan, is a very critical issue, because thanks to advocacy and the commitment of so many in government, in governments, among the Afghan women themselves, the case continues to be made that they cannot have their gainful, hard-won rights erased. So that's a major consideration, and has to continue to be, and can't be lost as whatever happens goes forward. Similarly, because of this kind of advocacy and hard work and pushing from allies, etc., there are women at the peace table, and we keep saying their role has to be meaningful, and it can't just be on the women's issues. They have to share their experiences and be full participants in all the issues that will be the terms of the agreement. So we have to do a far better job. And that goes for countries like ours that play a role in these other countries, however that role is a priority for us, and also the countries themselves that are engaged to understand better. But we still have, in my view, we still have a chasm. And if I can just say one other thing, because I think it's a great project for students, to look at peace builders. The Secretary General said, I was at a meeting last year, I guess, just before COVID, and he said, we've got so many conflicts. We're not doing a good job addressing them. They recur. We need to be bringing a new kind of resolution and creativity to the process. And he mentioned the work of people on the ground, and happened to say, is there enough going on? And many of the women in the room start saying, interrupting him actually in a way, that there was so much activity going on the part of women peace builders, but for the most part, they're completely disconnected from that high level official process. Call it track one, call what they're doing track two. They have to come together. Track one has to understand what's happening at track two and what needs to be done. So I think we need a lot of work on different ways that an inclusive process is carried out, not just at the peace table, that is the ultimate, but how we take what's happening now and really make it much more influential.
Thank you, Ambassador. And actually, in this morning's session, we talked specifically about Afghanistan, not surprisingly, and the exclusion of women from the peace talks. And there was a call to action in relation to our students and this consortium really focusing its attention on that particular context.
And if I might, Dr. Graham, just to say to the students that, you know, when their lives are a little bit freer in the post-pandemic world, their advocacy on Afghanistan, continuing to keep this issue in front of our Congress, is going to be really important.
Absolutely, 100%. Thank you for really emphasizing that point. And absolutely going back to what you were saying as well about national action plans and how important they are, but sometimes those deeper structural understandings of the inequalities and also of the feminist project and agenda are not always fully either understood or grasped or implemented at the national level and the international level. I'm going to hand back to Nick now because I know he has another question, and then I think we're going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Graham. Ambassador Verveer, I'd like to pose a final question to you, and this is a nice kind of call to action for the organization like our consortium and our mission. So you know that a common problem for academics and practitioners and activists who try to centralize gender in policymaking is that gender is often siloed in very narrow policy communities. Now, a key goal of our consortium is trying to promote gendered understandings foreign policy and security and in international affairs overall, outside of the traditional audiences that speak to each other on this idea. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how this can be achieved and what steps people like us can take starting today to make this change happen.
You know, Nick, that's a great question. And in a way, it's a follow-up to the integrative process within government that we started with. Because in essence, you need that cross-pollination. And in government, you could have a gender office or a gender-specific office that just did nice initiatives, important, but basically talked to like-minded people all the time. There's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't do what ultimately needs to be done, because we've got all these silos, and yet from fragility to conflict to rights to economic opportunity, we need an integrative model. And then on the outside, as you just said, we all come together, talking to each other, but we need to have those other voices. And I think one way to do it, perhaps in a way that can then be replicated more broadly, is to bring other groupings together, whether it has to do with economics or has to do with topics that are related and important to and fields, whether it's the private sector, government representatives, but to come together in this wonderful consortium that you have. You know, we often try to do this in a bigger event where you bring in people that don't necessarily talk to each other to say, look, we're all in this together. And to the extent that we make it work, it's going to work much better for everybody. And I think if you started on a small level, breaking down the silo and bringing in other voices, it would enrich the process, but in the end, it could even contribute to a much stronger outcome in the work of the students who are engaged in the consortium. So that might be one way to try with the situation, that it not just be confined to academia, as important to academia is, and to students, but those other voices from the other sectors. You talk to WPS Working Group, those NGO voices, people on the Hill, staff people, bring in some of those people, people in the private sector who care deeply about these issues, bring some of them in, and maybe all together at some point. But I think that way you broaden and you de-silo, if that's a word, you begin to break down the barriers.
Wonderful. That is a terrific answer. And I think it's a great segue into our next session, just because we've talked about how Dr. Kathleen Keenest, who gave opening remarks during our opening plenary session, she had this wonderful quote that gender is an invisible organizing force. And you know, your former boss, Secretary Clinton, has been quoted that gender equality is not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And this ties together a lot of your comments on how when you have gender equality, you're less likely to go to war. Your economy.
So, but Nick, on that point, it is so important. You know, that right thing, smart thing comes out of an understanding that so many of the decision makers, mostly male, that one works with, didn't get the moral argument, as critical and fundamental as it was and is the right thing to do. But the smart thing was, I can be more effective. I can maybe make a bigger difference in my position. And so saying it wasn't just moral, which is all important and the most fundamental consideration, but it also was critical to foreign policy execution.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. Ambassador Verveer, we are so grateful for your thoughts and for your time and your participation. So please, everybody, extend a virtual round of applause for Ambassador
Our
Verveer.
virtual, but I want to thank you all for what you've done and what you're doing every day with this. So Chantal, my good friend, take this away.
Thank you so much. I will hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Noelle Cohn, to introduce our second keynote participant, Chantal de Jonge Oudraat. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you, Ambassador Revere, Dr. Graham, and Nick for that wonderful discussion. Before I introduce you, Dr. de Jonge Oudraat, I'd like to take the time to thank you for all the support that you have provided the consortium throughout all these few months of launching not just our organization, but this event. Many of you on the phone may not know this, but Dr. de Jonge Oudraat was one of our first and biggest supporters in the launch of our group, and we couldn't have done it without your support. Thank you. And now it is my privilege to introduce you. Dr. Chantal de Jonge Oudraat is the president of Women in International Security, often more commonly referred to as WISE, is an organization that is dedicated to advancing the leadership and professional development of women in the field of international peace and security. She has held numerous positions, such as senior advisor to the U.S. Institute of Peace, Center for Gender and Peace Building, associate vice president and director of the U.S. Institute of Peace, Jennings Randolph Fellowship Program, adjunct professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and senior fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins University. She did her undergraduate studies at the University of Amsterdam and received her PhD in political science from the University of Paris. Her areas of specialization include women, peace and security, gender, international organizations, arms control and disarmament, terrorism and countering violent extremism, peacekeeping, use of force, economic sanctions, and U.S.-European relations. She has also recently served as co-editor for the new book, The Gender and Security Agenda, Promoting Equality and Peace in the 21st Century. I am honored to welcome you.
Thank you, Noelle.
Well, I guess we can get to the first question. So on that note of your recently published book, you recently co-edited a book with Professor Michael Brown entitled The Gender and Security Agenda. In your book, you touch on a number of issues as they relate to the relationship between gender and security. How do we elevate the role of gender analysis across all dimensions of international affairs instead of just those related to violent conflict?
Well, thank you, Noelle. First of all, I would like to say that I'm really very honored to be sharing the screen with Ambassador Melanne Verveer, who's a true gender equality and WPS agenda champion, both here in the US and in across the globe. I also want to take just one moment to congratulate you, Noelle and Nick and all the others for the creation of this consortium. And with this fantastic launch, I mean, you only had a few weeks, a few months, and you've put together an absolutely fantastic program. And I have to reassure you that we at the US Civil Society Working Group look forward to the partnership with the consortium. And I think in particular, we're looking forward to the intellectual firepower that is in the consortium and that will help us to bring about change. So you're asking about the book that was published last year. And, you know, one of the arguments we're making there, as well as in previous publications, is that we absolutely have to broaden the WPS agenda. This is not just an agenda that has to be concerned with armed conflict, but also with non-military security challenges, climate change, migration, etc. And the interesting thing, there's a study that was done by the LSC and by Laura Shepard, where they had been looking at the different national action plans on WPS. And they noted a very interesting trend that in many of these NAPs, we see increasingly that these NAPs become broader, that they will look at the human security agenda more broadly, and they will include issues related to migration, climate change, etc. And the other interesting aspect I thought of their study was the fact that increasingly these NAPs are also going towards a whole of government effort. And you know, you talked previously with Ambassador Verveer about the new Gender Policy Council, and the Gender Policy Council really has an opportunity here to marry and integrate the domestic gender equality agenda with an international gender equality agenda, because we can't be effective internationally if we're not integrating and if we're not championing a gender equality agenda at home. And so I hope that the new GPC, as it's called, will really integrate both the domestic and the international agenda. But, you know, it remains to be seen. And as always, the proof is in the pudding.
Thank you for that answer. I guess that's a great segue for our next question, which is the consortium's vision of change is innovative, intergenerational thinking around gender and security, especially concerning the WPS agenda. How can we shift the paradigm around WPS so youth, particularly those in academia like ourselves, are considered a legitimate stakeholder in the agenda's implementation?
Yeah, so let me take a little bit of an issue with this particular question. For me, the WPS agenda has to be an intergenerational agenda. And if it isn't, then something is wrong. And as you know, when was this? In 15 years ago, we launched this new youth, peace and security agenda because there was this sentiment that more attention had to be given to youth. And I always was a little reserved on that effort. I thought that this was an effort that had to be integrated within the WPS agenda. So for me, if you are not there, if this is not an agenda that is intergenerational, then we are doing something wrong. And I think you should, you know, fire us and start with a new crew.
No, that makes sense. I actually was one of the people who facilitated the intergenerational trauma panel. So I find that interesting, or your answer very interesting. And kind of to segue to another topic, I know this was not one of the original questions that we sent over to you, but I thought it would be an interesting one for the attendees to hear. And in many cases, when organizations and even individuals like yourself have pursued initiatives in increasing gender equality in international relations, they've received pushback. And given your distinguished career in the space of gender and international security, how do you continue to stay motivated in your research and your work, given this sometimes pushback you receive?
Well, there's a lot of pushback, and really, I am in a very privileged position. I live here in the United States, you know, in a very, very privileged position. And so I cannot complain about the pushback. I think the people who live in conflict situations where they're dealing with pushback daily, where pushback results in actual assault on their safety. And yet these people continue to be engaged politically and in different movements. And I think, one of the reasons why people continue to engage is because they really believe that that is the right thing to do. I think for me, one of the interesting things of the gender equality agenda is that this is such a broad, all-encompassing agenda. And I think Nick reminded us that Kathleen said, gender is just everywhere. It's like the air that we breathe. And that's true. And it affects everything. And when I'm looking at what the world will look like in the 20, 30 years from now, when we have all these new technologies, what does that mean in terms of gender relations between us? When we're looking at robots, new technologies, a sort of post-human societies and environments, what will that mean for gender relations? And I think the answer to that question is we actually don't know right now. And we certainly need a lot of people to engage on thinking about these future issues. And currently I'm working on a project that looks at gender and new technologies, and I'm trying to wrap my head around very, very complex issues. But that is what keeps me motivated to try to push this agenda forward.
Thank you for that. And now we have talked about a number of developing policy topics within the WPS agenda, including integrating LGBTQ+, queer experiences into the agenda and addressing intergenerational gendered trauma. How can we utilize the conversations that we've had here today? How can we share and engage with audiences on our policy positions following the event?
Well, I think, one of the things that I found so interesting in this symposium or this whole day launch that you put together is that you were very intersectional in your approach. And I think you will want to continue to engage with the people you have invited. You will want to continue to, engage with all the different organizations within the U.S. Civil Society Working Group. And this is something that Ambassador Verveer mentioned. I think that is very much also the intent and the objective of the consortium, is to engage with practitioners and policymakers, etc. I think it is important to have some, written products coming out of this launch event. Maybe you could also think of doing some podcast or video podcast of the events and sort of, taking out the most salient points that were made during the different workshops. And so, I think there are lots of different ways you can engage the public at large. And I would certainly also say that, use the organizations within the U.S. Civil Society Working Group. We are now, I don't know, 47 plus organizations in this group. You have a very special relationship with us, with this group. And so use the organizations to be able to push out your ideas. And, at some point we might be thinking also of maybe establishing some kind of exchange whereby, the interest of the members of the consortium are linked up with the interest and projects of the organizations within the U.S. Civil Society Working Group.
With what you just said in mind, one of the questions that I've been asking other members of the consortium throughout today is what was one thing that you enjoyed as you attended the parallel workshops as well as the opening session? And I guess I'll extend that question to you as well. What was one thing that you took away from your participation in our parallel workshops?
Well, as I said before, I think that you had a really intersectional agenda, and you had, a panel on feminist foreign policy, but also how to engage men and boys. You had a panel on intergenerational trauma. So you were thinking outside of that box of just women, because as many have said, unfortunately, we all know that gender doesn't mean women, but unfortunately, many policymakers still think that when you talk about gender, you talk about women. And I have to say, unfortunately, the Women, Peace and Security agenda has, of course, been framed as a women's agenda. Now, I think the progressive members of our community have understood that actually this agenda is about gender and is about power within societies, and the differences and unequal distribution of power within societies. But unfortunately, we're kind of stuck with this nomenclature of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. But you have moved beyond that right from the start. And so I thought that was very good and very powerful. I think I attended the workshop on men and masculinities. And I think it was Gary Barker who said that the WPS agenda, or the gender justice agenda, as he called it, really has to be a conversation about the structures and the patriarchy within our society. And, I think that is a point that we can't emphasize enough.
Thank you for that. And on that note, one question that Nick and I were talking about when preparing for this was, if you could have the chance to add another resolution, what would it be on? What would be the coalition strategy that you would have to pass it? And how would you like to see it implemented?
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not really sure we need another resolution. What we need is implementation of the resolutions and the policy commitments that we have made. I think if you look at, both the national and international legal frameworks we have, the political commitments, they're actually quite good. What is lacking is implementation. And why is implementation lacking? Because we have the patriarchy, this structure that is pushing back. We also have, sort of the rise of what I call the neo-patriarchs, the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, etc., who are actually pushing back, very actively against the gender equality agenda. So we have these obstacles. I don't think we need a new resolution. I think what we need is really action by all of us citizens, to impress upon our governments, our policymakers, that we have to implement this agenda.
Thank you for that. And given that you did participate in the Engaging Men and Masculinities panel, I guess, would you speak to some of the conversations that you had, expanding on your comment on what Mr. Barker said during the panel, as well as how you can continue to kind of integrate this idea of increasing men and masculinities from just an intersectional stance, as well as maybe even finding ways to incorporate it in the already existing WPS agenda?
Yeah, so you're asking a tough question there. With the danger of repeating myself, even we, knowledgeable about gender, etc., we often continue to focus very much on the position of women, and that is absolutely necessary. But I think sometimes we are not sufficiently paying attention to the role of masculinities, and the role of masculinities that is the way they are defining structures, procedures in our societies. And unless we sort of make that clear, unless we expose those processes, I think it will be very hard to make much progress. And again, I will cite Gary. He was talking about, he's the head of Promundo, that's a NGO doing a lot of work with men and masculinities in different parts of the world. And they're doing a lot of programmatic work. And he said, oftentimes when I'm talking with USAID and other bureaucracies, they are always asking me, but how can you scale this program up? But he said, actually, the issue is not scaling programs up, but scaling programs in. That is, looking within these structures and the institutions in our society to see how notions of masculinity and femininity are influencing the way they behave and are influencing procedures, processes, etc.
And in kind of our concluding question, given that we are running out of some time, I wanted to kind of draw the conversation from this idea of engaging men and masculinities to just looking at the way we view gender overtly versus focusing on gender in terms of just indirect engagement. For example, how can we address controversial reactions to the word feminism when we talk about implementing a feminist foreign policy and other gendered terms?
Well, just to take the example of feminism, I think the one way to counter pushback is to continue talking about it. I remember back in, when was it, 2013, 2014, Margot Wallström at the time was the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Sweden, and she had this idea that she wanted to launch a feminist foreign policy. And she wanted to give a speech at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And at the time, I was still working at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I was working closely with Kathleen Keenest. And I think we went to the front office of USIP and to some of our colleagues, and we said, the foreign minister wants to talk about feminist foreign policy. And people looked at us as if we were crazy. It was poo-pooed like all over the place. But lo and behold, hey, Australia, Canada, France, Mexico, have now all followed in the footsteps of Sweden. And within the US and here in Washington, D.C., we have a very active group on the feminist foreign policy that is being led by Lyric Thompson at the ICRW. And so by just sheer force of continuing talking about these issues and explaining what it actually means, people come on board and see that it's actually not that scary as it might seem in the beginning.
Thank you. And again, thank you, Dr. de Jonge Oudraat, for participating in today's event, as well as Ambassador Verveer. And I will bring the floor back to Dr. Graham.
Thank you, Noelle, and thank you, Dr. de Jonge Oudraat, and also Ambassador Revere. I'm going to conclude our event, but Ambassador, before we finish, I just wanted to give you one more opportunity to come in, because I have a sense, having listened to Dr. de Jonge Oudraat, you may have a follow-on comment or thought or idea that we'd love to hear. And I also want to alert everybody's attention to the panel we're having at the UN Commission on the Status of Women on the 19th of March. And I'm going to put the link to it up in the chat so that everybody can access that as well. So please do register for this panel. We'd love to see you there. It's about the role of higher education in the Women, Peace and Security agenda. But Ambassador, I just hand over to you for any final remarks.
Well, just one quick exclamation point after something that Chantal said that I couldn't agree with more. The question had to do with what resolutions should the students be working on to add to 1325. I agree with her 1000%. We don't need more resolutions at this point. We really need to implement the resolutions that have been adopted. 1325 plus 9 more, and we're still far from where we need to be to truly, truly realize the intent of what was put in place 20 years ago and still doesn't have what it needs to show in terms of governments taking it seriously and other actors taking it seriously to really tap this agency that half the population has that is not being applied to peace and security and utilized as it should be, as well as to finally deal with the impunity that sexual violence and conflict represents. So we have a long way to go, and that's why we need this consortium and the students so they can make more progress.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Verveer. Thank you so much, Dr. de Jonge Oudraat. We are so grateful for your time and for your thoughts. I would just like to also extend the largest thank you to everyone who attended and who participated in our event today. We're so excited about the conversations that took place and the new avenues for policy research that have been carved out and defined today. I want to emphasize that this event was our launch, as in beginning, and there is so much more to come from us in terms of engagement, research, and activism. So please follow our social media links, which we have dropped in the chat, and I'll turn it over to Noelle, who will talk about follow-up logistics in terms of email surveys after this event.
Thank you, Nick. So we'll be sending a follow-up email survey to everyone who attended today's event to determine the best ways we can engage with today's audience and our mission. Please also follow us on social media channels, which I believe Alice just shared in the chat, to stay up to date on our programming and events, and attend our upcoming panel on the role of higher education in shaping the WPS agenda at the Commission on the Status of Women, Friday, March 19th. Thank you so much for contributing to our interdisciplinary community of academics, activists, and practitioners working to promote gendered approaches to foreign policy and international security. Thank you all again for attending, and happy belated International Women's Day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Good luck.
Thanks very much. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.